The room held 31 people. That is not an accident. When my daughter Renee asked me in January how many guests I wanted at my 70th birthday dinner, my answer was specific: everyone. Her aunts and uncles on both sides. My old colleagues from the 31 years I spent at Redstone Arsenal. The neighbors from Mullins Cove Road who had known Caroline and me since 1989. The men from my church who had sat with me in the months after Caroline died and had not required me to be okay when I wasn't. 31 people gathered at the long table Renee had reserved at a restaurant on Whitesburg Drive in Huntsville, Alabama, on a Saturday evening in March. I wanted everyone there. Mitchell was counting on a smaller room. That was his first miscalculation. The dinner had been running beautifully for about 90 minutes. The kind of evening that earns its own warmth over time, good food and old stories, and the particular ease of people who have known each other long enough to skip the surface and go straight to the real things. My brother Earl from Decatur had told the story about the time I nearly burned down our grandmother's back porch in 1967. My old colleague Raymond had said something about a satellite component test in 1991 that I had nearly gotten both of us fired over. Renee had given a toast that I am not going to repeat here because some things belong to the room they were said in and to no one else. I was genuinely happy. That detail matters. I want you to understand that the hour before Mitchell stood up was a real and good hour, and that what he was about to do was going to happen in the middle of something that deserved better than what he was about to bring into it. He stood at approximately 9 o'clock. He picked up his wine glass. He tapped it once with a knife, the way you tap a glass when you want the room to look at you, and the room looked at him the way rooms look at a person who has risen to speak at a family gathering, with the relaxed expectation of warmth. He said, "I want to say something about my dad." The room settled. 30 people turned toward him with the comfortable attention of guests at a birthday dinner expecting a son's tribute. He said, "Dad, we love you. We're all so grateful you're here, that you're healthy, that you've given us so many years of leadership in this family. And because we love you." He paused there, the practiced pause of someone who has rehearsed the next sentence many times. "Because we love you, I think it's time we had an honest conversation. About the future, about the house." The room went quiet in the specific way that rooms go quiet when something unexpected has entered them. Not the comfortable quiet of a toast, the held breath quiet of 30 people simultaneously understanding that the event they were at had just changed its nature. My brother Earl, 4 seats to my left, looked at me. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. I withdrew a manila folder, the kind I had used throughout 31 years of engineering work to carry documents I needed to present clearly and without ambiguity. I set it on the table in front of me. Then I slid it slowly down the length of the table toward my son. It stopped in front of him before he could say another word. He looked at the folder. He looked at me. He picked it up and opened it. What happened to his face in the next 8 seconds is something I will not try to dramatize, because the reality of it was already more dramatic than anything I could construct. His expression moved through 4 distinct phases. The first was confusion, the look of someone reading words that don't immediately assemble into the meaning they expect. The second was recognition, the specific moment when understanding arrives and is not welcome. The third was something harder to name, the look of a man who has prepared for a confrontation and has just discovered that the confrontation was prepared for him first. The fourth was the one that stayed, a very still, very controlled blankness, the face a person puts on when they need time to calculate what comes next, and they do not have the time. Nobody at the table said anything. The silence lasted long enough for it to mean something. My name is William Tatum. I am 70 years old. I live in Huntsville, Alabama, and the folder my son picked up at my birthday dinner on a Saturday evening in March contained the answer to every question he had been planning to raise in that room for the past 14 months. He had been building his case. I had been building something else. Welcome to True Story. Before today's story, if you've ever watched one of these and thought, what if that happened to my family, I built something for exactly that. It's called Ironclad, and it's how you protect your legacy, your paperwork, and your peace before anyone gets the chance to test it. Scan the code on screen or hit the first link below. It's half off today. Now let's get into it. I spent 31 years as a systems engineer at Redstone Arsenal, the Army's primary missile and space defense installation here in Huntsville. I started in 1982 right out of Auburn with a degree in aerospace engineering and spent the next 3 decades working on propulsion systems, guidance integration, and the specific kind of structural problem solving that defense and space programs demand, which is a particular discipline because the margin for error is not a margin at all. When a system fails in that environment, the failure is not recoverable. You do not get a second chance to find the wiring fault. You find it before the test, or you find it when it costs you everything. I retired in 2013. The work had been the right work for me, and 31 years was the right amount of it, and I left with the satisfaction of a man who understood what he had contributed and was ready to contribute differently. Caroline and I had built a life in Huntsville over those decades, in the house on Mullins Cove Road that we had bought in 1989 and renovated in phases over 20 years, until it was exactly what we wanted it to be, a 4-bedroom craftsman on a half-acre lot that backed up to a tree line Caroline loved because of the light it made in the late afternoons. Caroline Ruth Tatum, born Caroline Ruth Mercer in Florence, Alabama in 1953, was a librarian for 26 years at the Huntsville Madison County Public Library, and the kind of person who made the people around her more themselves rather than more like her. She was the social intelligence of our family, in the way that some people are the structural intelligence of theirs. She understood what was happening in a room before the room understood it about itself. She organized knowledge for a living, and she organized the people she loved the same way, not controlling them, but understanding the systems they were inside, and quietly reinforcing the ones that worked, and flagging the ones that didn't. She had a habit that I have been thinking about constantly since she died, which was that she wrote things down before she needed them. Not just lists, observations, notes to herself about what she was watching in our children, in our neighbors, in the patterns of our lives that she thought might become relevant. She kept these in a series of notebooks that I did not fully explore until the first winter after her death, and what I found in them was a woman who had been preparing for things she hoped would never happen, quietly and consistently, for decades. She had read Mitchell clearly since he was in his 20s. I understood this when I found a notebook from 2014, with a single entry about him that took up half a page. She had not been angry in the entry. She had been precise. And everything she had written, 8 years before she died, had become, in the years following her death, exactly what she had described. She died in September of 2022. Ovarian cancer. 14 months between the diagnosis and her death. 14 months of the particular grief that comes from losing someone by degrees. Because each day that passes is also a day you can still see them, which means the loss is always arriving and never fully there until it is finally, completely there. And then it is the only thing. She said something to me in July of 2022, in the last good stretch before the last hard stretch. We were sitting on the back porch, and the afternoon light was doing what it does through the tree line, and she had her hand on the armrest of her chair, and she looked at the trees for a while before she said it. She said, "William, when I'm gone, watch what Mitchell does in the first year. Not the first month, the first year. The first month he will grieve. After that, watch what he watches." 2 weeks after Caroline's funeral, Mitchell asked me if I had updated my estate documents since her passing. Mitchell Aaron Tatum was 45 years old and had been in residential real estate development in Huntsville for 16 years. He was smart in the way that people are smart when they have found the specific application that fits the shape of their intelligence, and real estate had fit Mitchell's shape in a way that nothing before it had. He could read a property the way I could read a load-bearing calculation. He knew the difference between a neighborhood on the way up and one that had already arrived. He had built and sold 11 residential developments in Madison County over 16 years and had made real money doing it. He was also a man who had never fully distinguished between the things he had built and the things he had inherited. The confidence that served him professionally had a tendency to extend itself into territories it hadn't earned, and he had spent his adult life in a general proximity to the things our family had built, without quite understanding that proximity and ownership were different categories. He called me once a week. The calls were warm and efficient, and covered the necessary ground of a son checking on a recently widowed father without exceeding it. He asked about my health. He mentioned his children. He referenced the house once every 3 or 4 weeks, with a different framing each time. The maintenance question, the market question, the aging in place question, the estate planning question. He was too smart to push directly. He circled. His wife Suzanne was 42, and operated as the more strategic half of whatever they were working toward. Where Mitchell circled, Suzanne mapped. She had begun dropping in on Sunday afternoons about 2 months after Caroline died, always with a container of food, and always staying exactly long enough to walk through 3 or 4 rooms while we talked. She had a particular habit of pausing in doorways and looking at rooms with an expression she probably thought was subtle. It was not subtle. What she was doing in those doorways was the same thing Mitchell was doing in those phone calls, assessing. I had a daughter. Renee Claire Tatum was 40 years old, lived in Nashville where she managed a nonprofit arts organization, and called me at 7 on Tuesday and Thursday mornings because she had decided that was when I most needed to hear a voice, and she had been right about that without asking. She drove down from Nashville once a month, sometimes twice, and she had never once in the 14 months since her mother died walked through a room in my house with Suzanne's particular doorway expression. She walked through rooms the way her mother had, looking at what was already there, not calculating what it might become. Renee had come to me in November of 2022, 2 months after Caroline's funeral, and said, "Dad, I'm worried about Mitchell, not in a way I can prove, just in a way I can feel." The feeling was accurate. By November I was already working on something. What Renee didn't know yet was how long I'd been working on it, and what exactly I had built. I called my attorney in October of 2022, 5 weeks after Caroline's funeral. Her name was Margaret Oates, 56 years old, an estate and property attorney with an office on Clinton Avenue in downtown Huntsville. She had handled Caroline's and my estate planning since 2014, knew both our wishes precisely, and had the quality I valued above everything else in a legal professional. When she told you something would work, and when she told you it wouldn't, that was the end of the conversation. The meeting lasted 2 hours. I told her what I had been observing since Caroline's death. I told her what Caroline had said on the back porch in July. I told her about the weekly calls and Suzanne's doorway habit, and the estate question that arrived 2 weeks after the funeral. Margaret listened the way she always listened, with a yellow legal pad and a pen she barely used because she was storing what I said, rather than transcribing it. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said the house was the center of gravity for everything I was describing, and that the house was where we needed to start. The William and Caroline Tatum Family Trust had been created in 2014, but the house had not been transferred into it at the time. Margaret had recommended the transfer then, and we had deferred it for reasons I no longer remembered as meaningful. In October of 2022, we stopped deferring. The deed was transferred in December. The Tatum Family Trust became the sole owner of the Mullins Cove Road property. I remained the trustee. Renee was named successor trustee and sole beneficiary of the residential property. The transfer was recorded with the Madison County Probate Court. It was clean, legal, permanent, and completely invisible to anyone who wasn't looking at the county deed records. Mitchell was not the kind of person who checked deed records. He was the kind of person who assumed the thing he was planning for was still where he expected it to be. That assumption was worth 4 months of his planning and 2 years of his patience, and every circling phone call, and every visit from Suzanne, with food and doorway expressions. I also did one more thing. I asked Margaret to prepare a formal accounting document, dated and notarized, summarizing every financial transfer I had made to Mitchell since 2015, the loans described as temporary, the business investments described as opportunities, the down payment assistance on the house Mitchell and Suzanne had bought in Jones Valley in 2018. The total, across 7 years, was $84,000. not $1 of which had been repaid. Margaret looked at the number when she finished the accounting. She said, "This changes the picture considerably." I said I knew. She said, "William, are you prepared for what Mitchell is going to do when he understands the house isn't available?" The question sat in the room for a moment. I thought about 31 years of aerospace engineering. I thought about what it meant to run a system test, knowing that failure in that environment was not recoverable. I wasn't going to fail the test. I had run the numbers. The months between December 2022 and March 2024 were the quiet months, the ones that don't look like anything from the outside, but that are the months when the structure is being built and tested and confirmed. Mitchell continued calling on Wednesdays. I continued answering. The house question continued arriving in its rotating framings, and I continued redirecting it without alerting him to anything that had changed. I had one direct conversation with him in August of 2023 that I want to describe, because it was the moment I understood exactly how far along his planning had progressed. He came over on a Saturday. Suzanne stayed home, which I noted because she almost never stayed home when Mitchell came to see me. He came alone with 2 cups of coffee from the place on Memorial Parkway, and he sat in the living room, and he was warmer than the weekly calls, more present, more deliberately relaxed, and I understood within 5 minutes that this was a prepared visit. He had rehearsed the version of himself he was bringing into the room. The warmth was real enough on the surface, but there was something underneath it that a 31-year career in systems testing had made me sensitive to. The quality of a person who is managing toward an outcome. He talked for 20 minutes about general things and then, with a naturalness that had been practiced until it felt unpracticed, he said he had been thinking about the house. He said Huntsville's market had been remarkable, and the Mullins Cove Road properties had appreciated significantly. He said he had a colleague at a development group who had approached him informally about properties in this zip code. He said he wasn't suggesting anything, just sharing information, just wanted me to have the full picture. The full picture. He was describing a sale, not a future hypothetical, but a current active interest. He had already been in contact with a buyer. He had been having this conversation with someone before he had it with me, which meant the conversation with me was not information sharing, it was positioning. I told him I appreciated him sharing that. I told him the house wasn't something I was thinking about changing. He said of course, completely understood, just wanted me to know. He stayed another 30 minutes and left with the particular energy of a man who has planted something and is now giving it space to grow. After he left, I went to the back porch and stood at the tree line for a while. The August heat in Huntsville has a weight to it that the late afternoon doesn't fully lift, and I stood in it and I thought about what Caroline had written in her notebook in 2014, and what she had said on this same porch in July of 2022. 2 data points, 8 years apart, arriving at the same conclusion. Then I went inside, and I called Raymond. I told Renee everything in January of 2024, 2 months before the birthday dinner. She came down from Nashville on a Friday evening, and we sat at the kitchen table, where Caroline and I had sat for 30 years, and I laid it out the same way I would have laid out a systems analysis at Redstone, sequentially, without editorialization, every component in the correct order. The trust, the deed transfer, the $84,000 accounting with its notarized summary and supporting bank records, the August visit, and what Mitchell had described in the careful language of a man who had already spoken to a buyer, and then the November phone call from Dennis Crowell, which I described in full, including the $890,000 projected sale price, and the phrase, family situation resolving itself in one direction. Renee did not interrupt once. She sat with her hands flat on the table, and she listened the way her mother used to listen, with the whole of herself, and not just the part that was waiting for a pause to respond. When I finished, she looked at the table for a long moment, and then she asked when I had known it was this serious. I told her about the backyard, the porch, July of 2022. She absorbed that. The specific knowledge that her mother had seen this from her own dying and had left instructions for after. Renee took a breath that was not quite steady, and then steadied it and said, "What do you need from me?" Everything, I told her. The birthday dinner was 7 weeks away. Mitchell had suggested it. which I had noted the moment he suggested it, because Mitchell suggesting a family gathering was not something that had a long history. He had suggested the restaurant and the date, and had handled the reservations himself, and he had done all of that because he wanted to choose the stage. He had something planned for that room, and he had built the audience himself. I wanted to be ready when he used it. Margaret had the folder prepared. 32 pages, tabbed and indexed the way I had learned to prepare technical documents over 31 years of engineering work. Logically organized, cross-referenced, and impossible to misread. Tab 1. The deed transfer document showing the Tatum Family Trust as the owner of the Mullins Cove Road property, recorded December 2022. Tab 2. The accounting of the $84,000 in transfers from me to Mitchell between 2015 and 2022, notarized, with supporting bank records. Tab 3. The information that had come to me in November of 2023 through a channel I had not expected. I want to tell you about Tab 3 separately, because it is the part of this story that changed my understanding of what I was dealing with, from a problem to a different category of problem entirely. In November of 2023, I received a phone call from a man named Dennis Crowell, a commercial real estate broker who had been operating in Huntsville for 22 years. Dennis and I did not know each other. He said he was calling because he had been approached by a colleague of Mitchell's about a residential property in the Mullins Cove Road zip code, and that in the course of that conversation, details had been shared that he was not comfortable being part of. He said he had looked up the ownership record on the property and found my name, and had decided to make the call. What Dennis described was a conversation in which Mitchell and his development colleague had discussed the Mullins Cove Road property, its lot size, its position relative to a proposed rezoning boundary, and a projected sale price of $890,000. The development colleague had described the property as a near-certain acquisition within the next 6 to 9 months. Mitchell had said the timing would depend on a family situation resolving itself in one direction. The family situation resolving itself in one direction. Dennis said he had no interest in being part of a transaction that appeared to involve a family member being managed out of their own property. He said he thought I should know. I thanked him, and I meant it. Tab 3 was a detailed summary of Dennis Crowell's call, signed by Dennis in the presence of a notary, attached to the public record of the proposed rezoning boundary he had referenced, attached to the assessed value of comparable Mullins Cove Road properties in 2023. 32 pages, 3 tabs, every answer in the room before anyone asked a question. Renee looked at the folder the night I showed it to her in January, and she said, "He has no idea. He has no idea." The birthday dinner. The restaurant on Whitesburg Drive had a private room, which Mitchell had reserved, with one long table set for 31 people, and a warmth that good restaurants produce when they have been given the time to do it right. I wore the gray jacket Caroline had bought me for our 40th anniversary, the one she said made me look like a man who had built something worth looking at. I wore it because it had a pocket precisely the right size for a manila folder. Quick pause here. If what's been happening in this story is making your stomach turn a little, the phone calls, the August visit, the broker conversation, that is exactly why Ironclad exists. The templates, the scripts, the document checklist, all of it is in the description. Scan the QR code on screen right now before you forget. Back to the story. Renee sat to my right. Raymond sat across from me, which I had arranged, because I wanted someone in the room who understood the sequence and would not be surprised by anything that happened. Earl was 4 seats to my left with his wife Donna. Mitchell and Suzanne were halfway down the table, where Mitchell had positioned himself with the instinct of someone who wanted sightlines to the whole room. For 90 minutes it was exactly what a birthday dinner should be. The stories and the laughter and the toast that Renee gave that I will not describe here. The food was good, and the room was full, and the people in it had earned the warmth they were sharing. I was genuinely there for all of it, not performing the evening, while managing the strategy beneath it, but actually present in the room, with 30 years of friendships, and the table full of people my wife had loved. Mitchell tapped his glass at 9 o'clock. The room turned to him. I watched his face as it organized itself into the expression he had prepared. The loving son, the responsible adult, the man who raises a difficult thing because he loves his father and someone has to. He was good at the expression. He had been practicing some version of it for months. He said what he said. The room went quiet. I put my hand into my jacket pocket. The folder came out and went down the table and landed in front of him, and he picked it up and opened it. And the first page was the deed transfer document, clean and recorded and dated December of 2022, showing the Tatum Family Trust as the owner of the Mullins Cove Road property in a filing that had been a matter of public record for 14 months. He read the first page. He turned to the second. He read the accounting, with its 7-year span, and its notarized signature, and its supporting bank records, attached in chronological order. He read each entry with the deliberateness of a man who is checking figures against a number he had in his head, and the number in his head and the number on the page were the same number, and the fact that it was documented in this format in this room was information he had not had when he stood up. He reached tab 3. He read Dennis Crowell's signed summary. He read the rezoning boundary document. He read the $890,000 projected sale price and the description of the family situation resolving itself in one direction. He set the folder down on the table. He looked at it for a moment. He looked at me. The room held 31 people, and 30 of them were watching the 31st look at a folder and understand something about the night he had planned and the night he was actually in. He said, quietly enough that only the people nearest him could fully hear, "Dad, when did you do this?" "December of 2022, I told him. 3 months after your mother died." He was quiet again. His jaw was working in the way that a person's jaw works, when the thing they need to say and the thing they should say are running into each other before they get to the mouth. He said, "The house. The house has been in the trust for 14 months, I told him. Renee is the successor trustee. That was always where it was going. I just made it official while I still could." He said, "I was going to—" He stopped himself, looked at the table. Suzanne, down the table, said his name softly. He did not look at her. Raymond, across from me, picked up his water glass and took a drink and said nothing, and his silence was the most eloquent thing in the room. Earl looked at me. I looked at him. He gave me the small, specific nod of an older brother who has watched a younger brother handle something correctly. Mitchell picked up the folder. He set it back down. He reached for his wine glass, and then did not pick it up. He looked at the table in the way that a man looks at a surface when he is trying to find something to look at that will give him time to think. After a moment that lasted long enough for the room to breathe fully twice, he said, "I owe you an apology." That is what he said. Not an explanation. Not a challenge. Not the deflection I had been prepared for. He said he owed me an apology, and the room received that the way a room receives an honest thing, with a very particular and almost relieved silence. I told him the apology was noted, and that what happened next between us was a longer conversation than this room required. I told him this was still my birthday dinner. I told him Renee had ordered a cake from a bakery on Holmes Avenue that I had been told was worth clearing space for. Something in his face shifted. The calculation went out of it, which is what happens to a face when it runs out of things to calculate and has to decide what it is without the numbers. He picked up his wine glass. The room, after a moment, did what rooms do after something large has passed through them. It continued. Conversations resumed at the edges and worked their way toward the center. Earl made a comment about the cake that produced a general laugh. Raymond caught my eye across the table and gave me the look that old colleagues give each other when a test has come back clean. Renee leaned toward me and said, near my ear, "She would have loved this. She would have. Not the conflict, the preparation, the folder, the December deed transfer she would have considered overdue, and the $84,000 accounting she would have described as simply what the record says. Caroline would have had the numbers before I did, and the folder prepared before I thought to call Margaret, but she had done what she could from where she was, which was to sit on the back porch in July of 2022 and tell me to watch what Mitchell watched. I had watched. I had built what the watching told me to build. Mitchell called me on a Wednesday 3 weeks after the birthday dinner. Not the circling call, not the estate question in its latest framing. A different kind of call. The call had a different texture from the first ring, a quieter quality, less managed, more like talking to a person than performing for one. He said he had been thinking about everything in the folder. He said the $84,000 accounting was accurate. He knew it was accurate, and he didn't want to pretend it wasn't. He said he had talked to Suzanne about it. He said Suzanne had agreed. He asked if there was a way to discuss repayment. Not all at once. Over time. Structured. The call lasted 40 minutes. By the end of it, we had agreed to meet with Margaret and formalize a repayment structure that both of us could live with. We met with Margaret the following Tuesday. She had a draft ready. Mitchell reviewed it, made 2 questions which were reasonable, and signed it. Whether Mitchell lives up to that structure over the years it will take to complete it is a question I am not in a position to answer yet. What I know is that the question exists and that it is attached to a signed document, which is different from where we were before the birthday dinner, in every way that matters. Suzanne sent me a card, a physical card, in an envelope, through the mail, which is not something she had done before. It said she was sorry for her part in the situation, and that she hoped we could find a way forward as a family. I put the card on the kitchen counter and sat with it for a while. Some things require sitting with before you know what to do with them. I am still deciding. Some things are complicated. I am 70 years old, and I know the difference between a problem that can be solved and a relationship that has to be rebuilt, one interaction at a time. The rebuilding is slow, and it requires more patience than the problem-solving did, which is saying something. I am working on it. Renee came down from Nashville the weekend after the birthday dinner, and we planted the first of the spring things along the tree line, following Caroline's garden notebook from the winter planning section she had kept for 20 years. The notebook had entries for every March she had tended the backyard. What went in, and when, and in what order, with notes in the margins about what had surprised her, and what she would change the following year. Reading it while we worked was the closest thing to gardening with her that the current arrangement allowed. At one point, Renee stopped reading and looked at the tree line and said, "She wrote a note in here from 2019. What did it say?" I asked. Renee smiled in the way she smiles when her mother has surprised her from across a distance. She said, "It says, William will need someone to remind him to start earlier in the season. He always waits too long." I set down the spade. She had known about my habits for 50 years, and she had written a reminder for after she was gone, tucked into a garden notebook in 2019, 3 years before she died, because she was the kind of person who thought ahead for the people she loved, even when she was doing something as ordinary as planting a garden for the following spring. She had been thinking about the spring after she was gone, and the spring after that, and who would be in the yard and what they would need. I had tried to do the same thing in October of 2022 when I called Margaret Oates. I had tried to think ahead in the way that Caroline had always thought ahead for me, to see the load that was coming and build the structure to carry it before it arrived. The structure held. The house is in the trust. The $84,000 has a signed repayment plan attached to it. The birthday dinner is a story that 31 people will tell in different ways for a long time. I started planting earlier this year. The tree line looks the way Caroline would have wanted it to look by the time the light changes in the late afternoon. That is the only review that matters. If this story hit close to home, don't wait for your own version of it. Ironclad is $8.99 today, 50% off. Link and QR code both on screen now. Get your family's paperwork locked down tonight. And if this story stayed with you, drop a comment below and tell me which moment hit you the hardest. Hit that like button. Subscribe if you are not already here, and I will see you in the next one. True Story uploads every week. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss one.